Hey everybody, welcome back to On Stage, Off Stage. I'm your host, George Sapio, and this is episode number 160, December 2022, and this is a very special show because it happens to close out our first 10 years of podcasting. First 10 years, you heard me say. And none of this would have happened if it weren't for the suggestion of my amazing wife, Maura Stevens, coupled with the generosity of WRFI Community Radio based in Ithaca and Watkins Glen, New York, who 10 years ago gave me a half-hour spot to start with and have supported this show for, as I say, once again, 10 whole years. That's 160 episodes, people, of playwrights, play readings, actors, producers, directors, designers of all kinds, dramaturgs, management, puppet masters, and mask makers. And we're not going to stop there. We're going to have another 10 years ahead of us, so buckle in and keep coming with us. And it has really been one heck of an amazing gift to be able to talk with so many talented and interesting people from all around the world. Which brings us to this month's very special guest, Theresa Fisher, the producer of new plays for young audiences at the Provincetown Playhouse. She is also an associate professor at Bronx Community College. We began talking about a subject near and sometimes dear to my heart, a very tricky stunt to pull off correctly, the post-show discussion. You actually wrote a whole book about it, didn't you?
I did.
Okay.
And it's funny how it got started. Because it came from New Plays for Young Audiences. We were, and I don't think either of them will mind me telling this, but one of our co-founders, Nancy Swartzell, and our dramaturg, Cecily O'Neill, after one of the post-show discussions we had, turned to me and were like, we don't like this. We don't like how they're doing. And I'm like, okay, well, then what do you want to do? I don't know. And I'm paraphrasing, of course. And I was sort of left in this place of, well, now what do I do? And so I ended up, and it was an interesting time too, because normally one of the frustrations we have with new plays is it can be hard to get youth audiences into the readings. They're just something that, it's hard to get them in. And for some reason, this was for a colleague of mine, Larry Brenner's the Big Bad, what was it? Uncle Big Bad and the Three Little Wolves. It was sort of a retelling of the Three Little Pigs from the wolves' perspective. And we had full house of kids. Like, I don't know how it happened. We'd used the mommy blogs. And so we had all of these kids, and all of a sudden it's like, we can't let them leave without doing a discussion. So we sort of had an impromptu throw in a discussion that I ended up leading. Funny part was I remember turning to Larry afterwards and saying, I can't remember the last time I led a post-show discussion. And it was only later that I went, oh, wait, I've never led a post-show discussion. That was my first one. But it obviously got me interested. All of that happening got me interested in this. And because I really wasn't finding anything besides really Liz Lerman, and there was a guy at Steppenwolf whose name is escaping me, had written a brief article also on HowlRound about post-show discussions, that I was like, I gotta reach out to folks. So I started doing the research, reaching out to folks, finding all sorts of interesting stories from, the playwrights who would tell me what I do on the stage when there's a post-show discussions. I sit there, pretend to be writing, but I'm just writing BS, 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 BS.
Don't give all the secrets away, please. Come on.
And it really got me thinking. And I talked with folks like playwright Susan Zeter, who was doing some really great work at that time with Imagination Stage, and she was working with youth and she was doing. She basically did a residency in a elementary school for one of her plays, Aviatrix, she was working on. So in other words, I was getting all of these really great ideas, and then I was able to compile them into the book. Like David White down at Towson was doing stuff even with clickers in the audience so that people could literally be reacting while they were watching rather than having to wait until the end of the performance to react. Because one of the things that he was telling me is that what you get a lot of in post-reading discussions is people remembering the end of the play. They don't necessarily remember the beginning.
Wouldn't clickers be disruptive to the performance?
That wasn't his experience of it. And again, this is about 10 years ago now. Okay. So, and I haven't talked with him since to find out if he's still been using that, but that was certainly something he found it really useful. He said that people found it useful and that they were, that was something he was advocating, was using at the time. And so I had all of these really interesting sort of grab bag now of things that people could do, some more tailored maybe towards TYA, but certainly others for any age audience. Although then the challenge became, have the book, which I thought was going to be like a $15 book. It turned out to be a $70 book, which was a bit of a, so that ended up being a little bit of a challenge because it did not get out as widely as I had wanted it to.
Is that because it's an academic book?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. And it was what Paul Grave had done. It was something new, and a colleague had turned me on to it called Pivot. And they were basically doing for books that weren't quite as large as your full monograph, but larger than a journal article. And that was sort of the place they were living in. And that's where this one fit into. But yeah, unfortunately, the price point of it was just a little bit much. And I do want to go back and revisit. I'm still trying to decide if I want to do a second edition, sort of go back and re-interview people and see where things have happened. Yeah. Things have changed in the last 10 years. Or my more recent thought was, and I'm still mulling this over, is take some of those activities, some of those alternatives to the traditional post-reading discussion, and see if I can get folks to let me try them out, because that's been one of the biggest challenges that I've come across, especially like with new plays. And I don't say this to disparage the playwrights at all when I say this, which is, when they're in the midst of that intense week of play development, and I try to introduce, let's do something different with the post-show discussion, most of the time the answer is they can't wrap their heads around it. And I've tried, let's talk about it beforehand so you can think about it before you come. And they're like, I'm not in that headspace yet, or let's try to talk about it early in the week. And so it doesn't work. The only time, and this was lovely, I had a playwright last summer whose name I love middle-aged names just escape me left and right, who did actually do one of the alternatives, which was we put easel paper around the stage. So the Provincetown in many ways looks a little bit like a black box when you get down to the stage part. And so just on two of the walls, we had easel paper or chart paper with questions that she wanted to ask written on it. And then we just had a ton of Post-it notes, and people just came down and wrote their responses on the Post-it notes and put them on the chart paper. And then when we were done, we just folded that up, and then she was able to take that with her. Right. And so that was a lot of fun, and she really appreciated that. And it was a much more relaxed vibe.
That's a great idea. I mean, I've suffered through so many talkbacks. I love talkbacks because there might be a gem that comes out that helps me with the play. And I mean, I did write a book on development, workshopping and all that sort of stuff. So it's very, very critical to me as an artist and a playwright. But coming up with new ideas rather than the traditional asking the same 9.5 questions. Yeah. That keeps the audience focused and yet somehow still makes it interesting so they feel like they're contributing. That's tricky.
Yeah. And I think too, and there's also, one of the things I got, and I get to be I'm a little bit of a stickler about this, is I said, for me, there's a difference between a talk back, which for me that's an established play. That's an add-on that like Playwrights Horizons does for their, the off-Broadway theater does for their subscribers that we're going to have. Maybe it's the playwright, maybe it's, the actors, and they're going to come out and take, questions from the audience. Whereas for me, a post-show discussion it's not for the audience, it's for the playwright. And of course, the challenge with that is trying to figure out what does the playwright actually need and what do they actually want. And, I have some playwrights who are like, I love them. I love the post-show discussion. They're really great. But I also feel like for me, a part of where I struggle a little bit with the post-show discussion is I feel like it can be unfair to the audience because they've just finished watching this play that's still in progress, in process. They are still processing what they've just seen. And now you're asking them to talk about it. and they may not have had time to sort of process through that yet.
Yeah, that is a big drawback. Yeah.
Yeah. And the challenge is, we've thought about, well, could we do like a survey monkey and have them answer afterwards after they've had time to think about it.
Yeah.
But of course, the challenge is, will they answer? And we don't know that they will. So, the sort of the thing is, the playwright doesn't want to lose that audience feedback. So do we just have written questions? We've done that. Sometimes that's helpful. Sometimes that's not. Sometimes I've also tried the things that I use in the classroom, like, here's a question, turn to someone next to you and talk about this first. The idea being that we might get more voices in the room that way, or maybe talking to somebody else. But again, unfortunately, I think the standard is still either you go with the standard, here's our questions, we ask them, hope we don't have somebody who decides to grandstand and talk all about.
Yeah, good luck with that.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm actually, one of the things I always am really stickler about is closing things down, or cutting people off when they do that, or trying to redirect. Yeah. And I do think, thankfully, from teaching, I've gotten a little bit better at doing that. And I even sometimes I had a playwright ask, an audience member ask the playwright a question that was actually something that we had been struggling with her during that week of development. There was a piece that we thought needed to be addressed, and she just wasn't seeing it. And the person asked the question that was similar to that. And about halfway through the question, I looked over and I could see the playwright was already getting ready to answer the question. And I actually then didn't let her answer the question. I said that she was I said, that's really interesting. And that's one of those things I'm going to let her sit with and think about for a while before she answers it. I also knew that the person asking her the question was a friend of hers, and she'd probably talk to her about it again later. But I thought my sort of thinking was with that, and I don't know that it was the right choice that I did that, but I think the idea of that it does get so fast paced sometimes that there isn't, like, you aren't given, even the playwright's not given room to sort of breathe with it.
Yeah.
Because that, like I said, as soon as halfway through the question, she was already ready to answer the question. I was like, no, I can't let her answer this because I don't know that she's actually heard the full question.
It's a tough time because the playwright's the object of the attention right now. And all the questions they are expected to have all the answers for, like a director midway through rehearsals, Yeah. And it's tricky because they think they've got it, and we all want to look like we know what we're talking about. Yeah. And with play development, that's not always possible because there are things about the play that we've thrown in there that we don't realize we've thrown in there, and somebody else notices it. And now we've got to process that, but we still have to come up with an answer.
Yeah.
How do you... Go ahead. Yeah.
Well, I was going to say, because what I usually like to do more and more is I don't let the playwrights answer it. I ask the audience to answer it. I ask for somebody else to answer it. And part of that also, I think I want to give credit where credit is due. This one again came from David White. He had told me a story, and I'm probably in my memory misremembering pieces of it. But as I recall, he had a play and they were getting ready for the post-reading discussion. And he said, one of the things he was struggling with is he was trying to figure out which characters needed more development, which ones, still did he need to put some more work into. And his dramaturg said, I've got an idea for how we could do this, because she was also going to be leading the discussion. She said, do you trust me? And he's like, sure. And so the question she asked the audience was, which character should we get rid of? Now, anytime I tell this story, either people go, ooh, that's interesting, or they gasp and say, that's horrible. How could you do that? But when he continues to tell the story, he said, what happened was, he said, one person raised their hand and said, oh, you can get rid of this character. And somebody else then raised their hand and said, oh, no, you can't get rid of that character. And he said, it continued to go all around until at one point I realized there was one character nobody had mentioned at all. And he said, there was my answer. Clearly that character was not yet well developed because they weren't even remembering. I
hope it wasn't the protagonist.
I don't remember if you told me which character it was or not. But that, and
that's interesting. That's a question I would have never thought of.
And I think for me, that's one of the things that I've tried to focus on. And you have to be careful because you don't want to be all cutesy with questions and trying to be tricky, but sort of how can I look at this from a different perspective? How can I get an answer, but not maybe come at it in the direct way that everybody's thinking of, in a way that maybe will trigger something in the brain or start a conversation that is much more interesting than here's a question, playwright answers, or playwright says, oh, I don't know, I have to think about that. That's a great question for me to think about. So for me, it's a lot about, it's not always about the questions themselves, although obviously asking the right question is going to be beneficial, but can I get a conversation started among the audience? Can I help? Because they're the ones we want to call on. We're trying to get feedback for the playwrights, right? Which is why playwrights sit in the back of the theater during a production, so that they can see how the audience is reacting. I remember somebody telling me once that you shouldn't, I'm paraphrasing. They weren't saying you shouldn't trust a playwright who doesn't sit in the back of the theater during a reading, but they were like, you can tell a lot about a playwright by where they choose to sit during the reading, like how well do they understand the audience process. And there's some, I was telling that story to someone who said that she knew a playwright who just couldn't stand to be in the room during a reading. It made them too nervous. But she was like, but he's a great playwright. So I don't want to disparage, but again, there's a lot of different ways to gather information as a playwright. And some are going to say, I don't really need the post-reading discussion. All I need to do is look at how the audience is reacting in the moment. And some are going to say, I would love to sit down with the audience and whatever they give me is what they give me. And that's going to be fantastic. And others who say, listen, if you make me do it, I'll do it. But I think it's silly and I'm not going to get anything out of it. I'll talk to trusted colleagues and that's how I'm going to get, feedback. So
I've heard alternatives where dramaturgs have asked the playwright not to be there for the post show and they record it. Or they ask the playwright to not interact. And they set the rules in the beginning. The playwright will not answer any questions. The playwright is solely here to hear what you have to say. Which I find is more easily achieved by having the playwright not there at all. But for me, I need to hear what's going on. I want to be spying on it somewhere. I want to see the reaction, because even in the talkback or the post-show discussion, watching the audience is critical.
Yeah.
It is critical just to see who's reacting to what's said about whatever last question that was. How do you initiate? How do you frame the rules for a post-show discussion? And are there any standard questions that you use to get things going or to explore other issues?
So a standard one that I have, often be, let's take a moment to breathe. Well, one, before we go in, I make sure the playwrights know after we ask the first question, there's going to be a long pause. Do not jump on the pause, because if we start talking first, the audience will never start talking because they'll think, great, we get to be audience for longer. So we can't, you have to wait. I will wait forever if we need to, but somebody will talk. It'll be fine. Trust me. So that's one thing I always have to prime ahead of time with them. And then I like to do it and with new plays, we also have in their program so the questions that the playwright wants to have asked, they're in a written form that they can write their answers. And unless the questions would somehow spoil something with the reading, we give them the questions right away. And then right after the reading, they have a chance to write, which gives us a chance to get things set up. Now, it's not a long time because you wait too long, the audience starts leaving. But so we've had a little bit where they've hopefully been sort of primed for this. But then when we sit down, I introduce everybody, and a lot of it is saying, we're not asking you to be the critic. This is a conversation. What we're looking for, what are some images, moments, maybe a phrase, something that stuck with you, something that you remember now. So it's a question somewhere along those lines. I usually, I'll fine tune it for the particular script or for how I'm feeling in that moment as I'm looking out at the audience. And then in doing that, hopefully then we start getting people offering different I remember this, I remember that. And then we can go into maybe if there's a question, what was one thing that you still had a question about? And again, sometimes it depends on the script. Sometimes there's something, because oftentimes, because I feel like there's so many people in the room during the development week, I try to not be another one of those voices. I feel like that can just add too much. So unless I'm specifically asked for my feedback, I don't provide it. But sometimes there will have been a question I've been niggling over during the week. And so sometimes I'll throw that out there, but I'll throw it out to the audience more so than to the playwright. At least that's always the goal. So that's kind of where I go. And I have a standard form that I put together that I have that sort of has here's the different things that I'm thinking about. So every time we go in, and I share it ahead of time with the playwright so they can take a look and either be like, yeah, these are some of the questions we'd like you to focus on, or here's some other ones. And sometimes I had a playwright who was like, did you like the play? Was one of the questions she wanted to ask. And I was like, could we reword that? Because, really.
That's a dangerous one right there.
Well, exactly. And she was a playwright who she was really, I loved her to death because she was not afraid. Whatever they were going to say, she was totally cool with. But I was like, I said, sort of the danger though here is we could just get, yes or no answer. Exactly.
You'll get rewrites for days.
Well, that, and also, but we're going to get yes or no questions rather than the other. So I have these sort of, one of the things I'll offer is I said we could have the art materials like we did for the one of the ones we did this time. And I've done that, especially because it's TYA. We had one where the playwright, it was a Saturday and the playwright had only wanted a post-reading discussion on Sunday. And I said, there's kids in the audience this time. It was only a handful, but there were kids. And she's like, nah. And I said, screw it. So after the play was over, I came down with butcher paper and markers and that. And I invited the kids onto the stage and we started drawing, and I started, just sort of talking about what they had seen. And pretty soon the playwright came out and then she started talking with them as well. So again, it's different when you have kids, because oftentimes that's the way you're going to want to engage with them. But, like I say to them, this isn't a question and answer so much as a conversation. And, like I said, we're looking for observations and reflections and, what did you see? What did you see? What did you hear? And then I oftentimes will also, like I said, I'll go to what questions do you have? And if they don't have questions, it could also be what moment or moments surprised you? What did you want to know more about? So I try to keep it really broadly open than that. And if somebody also asks a question or makes a comment, I'll often again go back to the audience, which was, did anyone else notice that? Or what else, just try to again keep the conversation going. As I oftentimes will tell the playwrights, in my ideal world, they will not open their mouth during the post-show discussion. It will all be done through the talking of the audience and me just trying to get them to keep talking.
Sure. Yeah. Moving to a different, I could still talk about this forever. Because, but you started talking about kids in the audience, and that's a perfect segue to our next topic, because I am the master of segues here. New plays for young audiences, which started 25 years ago, I believe. Yes. And annual play development series focused on developing work for young audiences ages 3 to 21. I want to talk about these audiences because theater for younger audiences is two things to me. One, it's a different animal. And B, it kind of answers the question, is theater dying? And I don't ever want to hear that again. It's just, theater's not going to die. It survived the plague in Shakespeare. It survived COVID. It's going to go away no matter what we do to it.
Yeah.
But
it survived the medieval period.
let's talk about these audiences. Why is theater, at least in my mind, which was a really bad way to phrase this, a different animal for younger audiences?
Well, it's so interesting too. One, and I want to clarify, one, we now actually say 3 to 18 because when we were saying to 21, we were also finding, because we're set in a university, there was a lot of misperception about that we were looking for plays for college students. And so moving down to 18 sort of helps with that. And that's also, sometimes people are like, how can you have something that appeals to 3 to 18? I'm like, well, we're talking like some will be for 3 to 5, some will be from 5 to 8. It's the range within that. And I think, for me, and as a lot of things that have happened in my life, I've sort of stumbled into every career I've had, I've stumbled into accidentally. And so I think it's about two things. And I say this partly also as one of my previous careers that I stumbled into was a play therapist, and play as in children's play, not as in theater plays. Mm-hmm. And I learned there a lot about how, children learn through metaphor. And so it makes sense that theater is perfect for them because it's a way that they are already understanding how the world works is through story. I could tell stories from being a play therapist where that was very clear that through that action of playing, they learned things they understood, they processed through their world. And I had to go into that world with them. I had to understand the stories that they were telling in order to hopefully help them learn to tell new stories. And so for me, theater is important for young folks is important for that reason, in that it's an important way to help them learn and develop into the world. And of course, yes, the selfish, if you want to call it, that part of me also who loves theater wants to build those theater audiences, get them hooked on theater from a young age so they stay with it throughout. But the play therapist part of me also says, yeah, but this is also important because it's important for how they just learn and engage with the world. And in fact, when you look at the really young, I had the pleasure of Tim Webb, who's a co-founder of Oily Cart over in the UK, just came out with a book called Sensory Theater. And I was fortunate enough to be able to read it. And it's a fascinating look of, because Oily Cart started with the 3 to 5 year olds, then went into working with kids with multiple disabilities and profound disabilities, then also went into working with autism and the very young. So they've had that whole spectrum of the youth audience. And it's really interesting to look at. And as I said, as I was reading it, I thought it was a really important book for just any theater maker to read, because he talks a lot about how we can get caught up in thinking about just the visual and the audio part of the theater experience, but also recognizing, we learn in a lot of different ways, and there's a lot of different elements that you can bring in, a lot of different sensory elements that you can bring into the theater. And I think that's something that for the young people, they're more apt to and more willing to dive into that, especially the really young, that you can have things where they're on the stage and, touching things, the tactile piece of it, as well as that. And I don't know, when I think about immersive theater, of course, for adults, there's some of that. We're starting to see little shades of the sensory theater-esque world, if you will, in things like immersive theater. But I do think, going back to what you were asking, that I think that for me, that's that 2-part piece of it, why theater for a young audience is so important, because of how youth learns, but also because we want to keep theater alive, and engaging with them early is, I think, is certainly a way to help with that.
Sure. You're talking about sensory theater and tactile. And one of the standards, at least in my experience for theater, is there's a fourth wall. Whatever happens on the stage is a different world than the audience who is sitting there and watching this, and it's 2 different spaces. Mm-hmm. So when you're talking about interactive theater, which is not nearly as popular probably as it should be, because I love it. I love being involved with the actual production, but having, especially for kids who have, attention span, getting them involved with it and having them become a part, or at least being able to access it, is absolutely critical. I mean, we could do that with adults too, but hey, so sensory, I mean, how would you frame something for a sensory theater as opposed to an adult theater? I mean, is there a fourth wall, or is there not really?
I mean, I think one, It's an interesting conversation to have. I was thinking about this. So I just caught a glimpse of, there was a little bit of a controversy with Hadestown on Broadway in that an audience member who's hard of hearing, I don't know if you caught this.
Heard about this. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. And the whole captioning thing and being called out. And so I feel like there's times because of technology and that where the fourth wall gets broken by the performers themselves. Not that happens a ton, but it is an interesting thing of that we talk about the fourth wall on the one hand, but on the other hand, I think, it's the whole suspension of disbelief sort of thing. We all agree that the fourth wall is there until it's inconvenient and then we forget about it. And I do think technology has a role to play in that. I'm also thinking of the person, this has been years ago and I can't even remember what play it was, but saw that there was an outlet. So climbed up onto the stage to plug in their phone so I could charge during the show. And so,
Yeah, I heard about that one too. Oh,
yeah.
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 Mm-hmm.
So I think the interesting thing with the sensory theater, and again, I'm still sort of processing through for myself how I'm thinking about this, but excuse me. I think one of the things, like, for example, he mentioned smells was something, the idea of using essential oils. And I thought, even something as simple as, have you ever thought about a scent as audiences are coming in? We oftentimes will have music playing. And again, I know people have allergies and that you got to be careful about stuff like that. But it was something I hadn't even thought about. Like I've thought about, pre-show music before and how the stage was lit, if we didn't have a curtain, but I'd never thought about before, what I might have as far as smells go, or,
that can be dangerous because there are people with multiple chemical sensitivity.
Exactly.
Go into anaphylactic shock or something.
Yeah. Which again, is not something I'm saying I would necessarily do, but again, it was just interesting to think about it. It hadn't even crossed my mind as something to consider, or even thinking about, touch. I mean, it could be something as simple, silly as, the program. I mean, the program is always the same sort of paper, but what if the program was something different? I mean, again, I'm just sort of spitballing here, but it just sort of got me thinking about how easy it can be to get stuck. And this is how we've always done it kind of thing. And I do think technology is sort of where a lot of our focus goes these days on what can we do? Oh, I've got a projector in the theater. Look at all the things I can do now with a projector in the theater, all the things that I can create. And so again, it just made me stop for a moment and think about how else could I engage with, or think about how I'm engaging with the theater. And again, obviously for young folks, it's a different kind of thing because their expectations are different, but it doesn't mean that there isn't something there that we can't also take for adult theater. Mm-hmm. If nothing else, like I said, just sort of, I think it's always good to take stock and reflect every once in a while. What am I doing? How can I be doing it better? And I mean, I know a lot of that comes from my teaching. I'm doing that all the time in teaching. I'm in the middle of doing that right now, doing some, because we're in the middle of the fall semester, but I'm already got plans for how I'm going to do things differently in the spring semester, because, always reflecting on what's working, what doesn't work.
You have to do that, especially, as a high school teacher.
Well, and I teach college though, but
No, in some cases, it's almost the same thing.
Well, I was going to say, I should clarify, I teach at a community college.
College, yes. Yeah, Bronx Community College.
Yes.
Let's talk about the scripts that are developed, new plays for young audiences. You developed 3 new scripts in the historic Provincetown Playhouse, which is beautiful and a lovely place to be. How do you select the scripts, and what's the process like? I mean, I'm a playwright for young audiences, let's say. I mean, what can I look forward to, and what is this process like?
So the selection process is one thing, and of course, then the development process is a separate thing. With the selection process, and it's a thing I wish I could skip every year because it's so hard. You get so many great scripts.
I know. Yes.
And you're like, oh, in fact, I used to, in the early days of producing, I'd spread the, our call for our submissions far and wide, and we would get, tons and tons. And then it was like, no, now I have more that I have to go through, which, to be fair, some of it also was we would get a lot of people who are like, I think kids would like this show. And I'm like, really? It's got 40-year-olds in it. What do you think the kids are going to like about this show about middle-aged characters? So we would get a lot of inappropriate scripts.
Yeah. Did you read the submission materials at
Yes.
all? Yes.
Which, and it's funny because we've fine-tuned the submission guidelines over the years because of those reasons. And I'm also much more careful about making sure I'm very much sending it out to young audience organizations that call more so than a wide swath like we used to do. And
it's
we
like
still
you never stop teaching, because as a teacher, high school, college, whatever, you have to make your lesson plan so specific to guide your students along this one path so they don't deviate and go 93 different places.
Yeah.
And you have to do the same thing with submission opportunities.
Yeah.
Make it all caps, put it in bold. People still miss it. I'm like, what?
And then to be fair, sometimes we're like, well, that's easy. They didn't understand the whole playwright goals. I had somebody literally once for the playwright goals just put ... And I'm like, I don't think you understand. This is not something we do for the fun of it. Yeah. We know what we can provide for a playwright. And if you say your goal is, I can't wait to get this on its feet and choreograph the dances, and we're like, that's not what we do,
right.
Then we know that's not going to be a good fit. You're not going to be disappointed, and we're not going to have disappointed you. So there's that. And we also recently added, because we had a bit of a kerfuffle with one playwright where there was a misunderstanding about what they had wanted. So now we have a big list of the things that you might want to work with. Are you planning on working with puppets? Are you planning on working with dance? All of those things, so that we have a sense of, oh, okay, this. And sometimes, like one of the scripts we picked last year, she had clicked a lot of those boxes, and we were like, oh, I don't think we can do all of that. But then we just reached out and we're like, and she was like, oh no, actually, I'm thinking I'm just going to do this. But again, we were able to have these conversations. And that's one of the biggest pieces in the submission process that we've learned is the more information we have, the better we can make sure that what we're offering is something that's going to be useful for the playwright, and that we can do what they need to have done. So when we're selecting, it's always hard because we look at the goals. Sometimes it's great when you read a script and you go, oh, I could see this, this, and this. And you look at their goals, and those are the exact same things that they mentioned. You're like, okay, good. Yeah.
But playwrights are not taught about development. They're not taught about what to expect from development of their script. It's, I wrote it. Where's my Tony?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's the challenging thing. And it's why, we have, when they come, and we used to, it's kind of interesting. We always had it before where they picked their director. And at some point, somehow it slipped into we were picking directors. And I don't even remember how that happened. But then we sort of had the aha moment at one point of like, no, the playwrights really do need to pick their director to make sure that that's somebody who they feel comfortable working with, that's going to work well with them. And sometimes, we've had one of our scripts last time, they were like, we don't really have anyone in mind. Who do you recommend? And we found somebody who worked great with them. And in fact, that play just got published. And then we have, so there's that piece of it. We always pick the dramaturg because that's one that we like to have a little bit more control. Plus, we tend to have a resident dramaturg, so they're the same for all 3 weeks. That consistency is nice because they also liaison with the graduate class that accompanies the series. They're sort of our voice in the classroom. And so that works out well. But like I said, so the submission process comes down to a lot of different factors. Are the goals something that we could definitely help this playwright with? We're also looking at, we want to make sure that the class has a nice spread of scripts to look from, because the class is learning about play development. I love it when we can have an early career playwright, a mid-career playwright, and a veteran playwright as our 3 scripts, because I think that provides a nice spread for the class. Again, and it's usually oftentimes it's one of those things where we get to where we pick this season. And I thought, oh, look at that. We did that. We want to try to make sure that the voices that we're amplifying in the room are, voices that are relevant for the youth today.
Absolutely.
So that's one of the big things we're looking at. Who's this, what's the story about? Who's the story reaching? Diversity is something we're really aware of. In fact, we started a mentoring program during 2020, during the pandemic. We had that year was off, which is why technically last year would have been our 25th anniversary, but now 2023 is going to be. and so we ended up doing this in 2021. We ended up doing this mentoring program for global majority playwrights. And then we decided for the second year, so we sort of piloted it. For the second year, we decided one of the draws would be that one of those plays would automatically get picked for one of the 3 slots in the full series as a way to hopefully amplify voices. And it's nice for us too, because during that mentoring process, we get to know the playwrights a little bit better so that we can come in and say, this play, this playwright is really great to work with. This is where this story is really great. Let's slot that one in. And then, so there's a lot of different factors that we're looking at. Every once in a while, I remember one year we had a play. It was a fantastic play, but we looked at it and we're like, it's done. There was actually nothing. And then I ended up sending it to folks I know at the Kennedy Center to see if they could help get it on its feet, because it really didn't need us in it anymore.
Would that be for New Visions, New Voices?
Actually, at that point, because I knew New Visions, New Voices didn't need it, but I reached out to David Kilpatrick to be like, I've got this script that's come to us. What do you think? Is there, I don't know if, with the touring company, of course, this is pre-pandemic, or on their main stages, and I also knew that they had contacts as well that they could reach out to. Let's see what we can do. One of the great things that Kim Peter Kovac and Deirdre Lavrakis did was create Write Local, Play Global along with Tony Mack. And so that's a great resource that I've used, and that, is another way we can help get plays. So that's one of the things for this series that I think Nancy and Lowell did really well, especially Lowell Swartzell, because he was a playwright himself, and they were both big names in the TYA field. And so they were really able to connect playwrights to theaters and that to really help. And publishing was a little bit more robust back then too. I mean, I remember and this was before I was producer. I think it was the year I was an actor in the series. So this would have been 2008. There was a publisher from, I can't remember now the name of the publishing company, but she came to see the shows. That was standard. They had those relationships, and that's something I feel like somehow over the last several years has been harder to get the plays to that next step.
The past several years have been very hard to get anybody to go in.
Yeah,
it's been
yeah.
Theresa, this has been great. I mean, time has absolutely flown here, and I really wish we could go on for another couple of hours, because I could talk about this stuff all day, and it's really, really interesting. You do so much good work. Thank you.
We try.
Yeah. Well, theater's fun. It's wonderful. Thank you so much for being here. And I look forward to hearing more about what's going on with new plays and younger audiences, and much better post-show discussions, please. But yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hey kids, thanks for listening to On Stage, Off Stage. On Stage, Off Stage is produced monthly, and all of our shows can be found at onstageoffstage.org and also on iTunes and Spotify. If you enjoy what we do, please recommend us to your friends. Don't forget to like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter at OnOffStage. And if you are a theater artist with an upcoming project of interest or know of someone in the theater who'd make some seriously good chat, by all means, send us a note at info@onstageoffstage.org. I'm George Sapio. Thank you once again for listening. And please, stay safe, be careful, not only for yourself, but for those with whom we all share this rock. And as always, happy theatering to all of you.